At the Sterling Lounge, old money flows as freely as aged bourbon, and unspoken rules are as polished as the brass railings. For 49 years, Memphis's most exclusive jazz club has carefully maintained its standards, until tonight. When a sharp-suited stranger walks through its Art Deco doors, he carries more than just ambition. He holds the deed to the club and decades of unfinished history. Some traditions are about to hit their final note. Marcus Thompson wiped his palms against his tailored charcoal suit as he stood across the street from the Sterling Lounge. The upscale jazz club had been a fixture in downtown Memphis for over 40 years, its Art Deco facade and neon signage a testament to its storied history. He'd dreamed of this moment for months, ever since his investment group had quietly purchased the establishment from its retiring owner, Harold Sterling. At 42, Marcus had built a successful chain of restaurants across the Southeast, but the Sterling Lounge was different. This was where his father, a talented jazz pianist, had been refused entry in 1975 despite having a scheduled performance. The story had fueled Marcus's drive to succeed, to prove that talent and determination could overcome prejudice. The club's current manager, Richard Walsh, didn't know about the ownership change yet. Harold had agreed to keep it quiet until the official transition next week, wanting to observe how the staff operated under normal conditions. Marcus adjusted his Rolex, a reminder of how far he'd come from his childhood in South Memphis, and headed toward the entrance. The early evening air was thick with humidity, typical for a Memphis summer. The line of patrons waiting to enter stretched around the corner, a mix of tourists and locals drawn by the club's reputation for world-class jazz and sophisticated atmosphere. Marcus bypassed the line, planning to sit at the bar and observe the operations firsthand. As he approached the velvet rope, the doorman, a burly man with a crew cut, gave him a once-over. Despite Marcus's expensive suit and polished appearance, the man's expression remained stern. "End of the line, sir," he said, emphasizing the last word with barely concealed disdain. "I'd like to speak with Richard Walsh," Marcus replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. The doorman's radio crackled to life, and after a brief exchange, Richard Walsh himself appeared at the entrance. He was a thin man in his 50s, with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air. His carefully pressed shirt and vest spoke of someone who paid attention to details. "Is there a problem here?" Walsh asked, his tone suggesting that he already believed there was. "No problem," Marcus said. "I'd just like a seat at the bar. I'm interested in the music tonight." Walsh's lips thinned. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at B.B. King's down on Beale Street." The suggestion carried an unmistakable message. Marcus had encountered this before, the polite deflection, the subtle steering toward other venues. He'd prepared himself for this possibility, but the familiar sting of discrimination still pricked at his consciousness. "I see several empty seats at the bar through the window," Marcus observed, keeping his voice level, "and I notice you're letting others in." Indeed, while they spoke, the doorman had admitted 3 couples, all white, who had been behind Marcus in line. Walsh's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. This is a private establishment with a certain standard to maintain." Walsh straightened his vest, a nervous habit that betrayed his discomfort. Marcus could feel eyes on him from the line. Some patrons looked away awkwardly, others watched with morbid curiosity, and a few showed clear discomfort with the situation unfolding before them. A young couple near the front of the line stepped out, the woman whispering something to her partner as they walked away. Inside the club, the house band was warming up. The muffled sound of a saxophone running scales filtered through the heavy doors, a bitter reminder of his father's story. How little some things had changed, Marcus thought, even as the world around them transformed. "I understand," Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Walsh tensed slightly, but Marcus only withdrew his phone. "Would you mind if I recorded our conversation? I'd like to document your explanation of these standards." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Walsh's face. The doorman shifted his weight, glancing between his manager and Marcus. The line had grown quieter, the typical chatter of waiting patrons dimming, as more people noticed the confrontation. "Are you threatening me?" Walsh demanded, his voice rising slightly. "I've handled troublemakers before. I can have security here in seconds." Marcus remained perfectly still, his phone held casually at his side. No threats, Mr. Walsh. I'm simply curious about your admission policies. Perhaps we could discuss them in your office. I'm sure you have them documented, given recent updates to civil rights legislation. A bead of sweat rolled down Walsh's temple despite the club's air conditioning spilling out onto the sidewalk. The mention of documentation had clearly rattled him. The Sterling Lounge had faced complaints before, but they had always been handled quietly, swept away with careful words, and the occasional envelope of cash. Behind Walsh, through the club's windows, Marcus could see the house band's pianist watching the scene unfold. The man's fingers had stilled on the keys, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, Marcus saw his father's face superimposed over the pianist's, younger, full of dreams that this city had tried to crush. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and Harold Sterling himself stepped out, earlier than expected for their planned meeting. The retired owner's presence was about to change the dynamic completely, but Marcus held his ground, waiting to see how Walsh would react to this new development. The evening was about to take an interesting turn, but the real story, the one that would reshape the Sterling Lounge forever, was just beginning to unfold. Harold Sterling's appearance sent a ripple through the waiting crowd. At 72, he still carried himself with the dignity that had made the Sterling Lounge legendary, though age had softened his once imposing frame. He wore a cream-colored linen suit that gleamed in the evening light, his shock of white hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity. Walsh's demeanor shifted instantly. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting you this evening." His voice carried a nervous tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "Clearly not," Harold replied, his deep southern drawl tinged with something that might have been disappointment. He turned to Marcus, extending his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I believe we had an appointment." Walsh's face drained of color as he watched his boss greet the man he'd just tried to turn away. Marcus accepted Harold's handshake, noting how Walsh's eyes darted between them, calculating, reassessing. "Richard," Harold said, "why don't you join us in my office? Trevor can handle the door." He nodded to the doorman, who seemed grateful to be excluded from whatever was about to unfold. As they walked through the club, Marcus absorbed the atmosphere he'd soon be responsible for. The Sterling Lounge was everything the photos hadn't captured, the warm glow of Art Deco sconces casting intimate shadows, the polished mahogany bar stretching along one wall, the carefully preserved original tile work. The house band had resumed their warm-up, filling the space with subtle jazz undertones. They passed Nicole Chen, the head bartender, who'd been with the club for 15 years. She caught Marcus's eye with a knowing look. She was one of the few employees Harold had trusted with the news of the sale. Her slight nod conveyed both welcome and solidarity. Harold's office was a testament to the club's history. Signed photos of jazz legends lined the walls: Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald. Marcus's eyes landed on a photo of a young black pianist, dated 1975, his father. Harold had hung it there recently, after their first meeting about the sale. "Sit down, gentlemen," Harold said, lowering himself into his leather chair. Walsh chose the seat nearest the door, his usual confidence evaporating by the second. Before anyone could speak, there was a knock at the door. Nicole entered with 3 glasses of the club's famous bourbon, aged in their own private select barrels. She set them down without a word, but her exit spoke volumes, a graceful retreat from an impending storm. "Richard," Harold began, "I've known you for 12 years. You've managed this club effectively, kept the books clean, maintained our reputation." He paused, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "But I've also heard things, whispers, reports that I chose to ignore, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of cowardice." Walsh straightened in his chair. "Mr. Sterling, if this is about what happened outside, I can explain. We have protocols for dealing with potential troublemakers." "Troublemakers?" Harold's voice carried a sharp edge. "Is that what you saw when you looked at Mr. Thompson? Tell me, what exactly marked him as trouble?" The silence that followed was deafening. Through the office walls, they could hear the band starting their first set, the smooth notes of "Take 5" seeping into the room. Marcus sat quietly, observing. He'd been in enough boardrooms to recognize a man realizing his position was crumbling. Walsh's fingers drummed against his armrest, his wedding ring tapping out a nervous rhythm. "Harold," Walsh said, switching to a more familiar address, "you know the kind of clientele we cater to. our reputation, is about to change significantly, Harold interrupted. He turned to Marcus. Would you like to explain, or shall I? Before Marcus could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, it was James Marshall, the club's longtime booking manager, looking concerned. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. Tonight's headline act is stuck in Nashville. Airplane troubles. They won't make it. Walsh seized the opportunity to assert his authority. This is exactly why we have contingency plans. I'll handle this. He started to rise. Actually, Marcus said, speaking for the first time since entering the office, I might have a suggestion. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I know someone who could step in. Dad's been wanting to play this stage again for 49 years. The implications of this statement hung in the air. Walsh sank back into his chair as Marcus made the call, his face a study in dawning comprehension. James Marshall's eyes widened with recognition. Wait, Thompson, as in Calvin Thompson? The Calvin Thompson who used to play with Miles? Marcus nodded, waiting for his father to answer. The pieces were falling into place, but the night's real revelations were still to come. The bourbon in his glass caught the light, untouched, much like the truth that was yet to be fully unveiled. Calvin Thompson's voice crackled through the phone's speaker, still strong and clear at 78. Son, what's this about the Sterling Lounge? The mere mention of the venue made Walsh shift uncomfortably in his chair. Dad, how'd you like to play tonight? Full band, main stage? Marcus watched Walsh's face as he spoke. The manager's complexion had taken on an ashen hue. There was a long pause on the line. That place? After what happened? Calvin's voice carried decades of hurt, but also a hint of curiosity. Things are different now, Marcus said, his eyes meeting Harold's. Trust me. Another pause, shorter this time. Give me an hour. The line went dead. Harold smiled, reaching for his bourbon. James, please make the necessary arrangements for Calvin Thompson and his quartet. They'll need the stage at 9. James nodded and hurried out, barely containing his excitement. Walsh found his voice. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, we can't just... Can't just what, Richard? Harold's tone was dangerously soft. Can't just book one of Memphis's finest jazz pianists because of what happened in 1975? Or can't just book him because he's black? The band outside had finished Take 5 and moved into a smooth rendition of So What? The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. That's not what I meant, Walsh protested weakly. Our regular clientele? We'll have the privilege of witnessing history being made right, Harold interrupted. He turned to Marcus. I believe it's time. Marcus nodded, reaching into his suit jacket. He withdrew a manila envelope and placed it on Harold's desk. Walsh eyed it suspiciously. Richard, Harold said, I've been meaning to tell you about some changes coming to the Sterling Lounge. You see, after 43 years, I'm retiring. Walsh sat up straighter. He had been angling for ownership for years, dropping hints, making suggestions. His expression shifted to one of anticipated triumph. The club has been sold, Harold continued. He gestured to Marcus. Mr. Thompson's investment group finalized the purchase last month. The official announcement was scheduled for next week, but given tonight's events, it seems appropriate to move up the timeline. The sound of Walsh's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the music. His face cycled through emotions: disbelief, anger, understanding, fear. You can't be serious, he whispered. Oh, but I am, Harold replied. In fact, Marcus has been quite clear about his vision for the club, maintaining its legacy while expanding its horizons, breaking down the invisible barriers that have, frankly, tarnished our reputation in certain circles. Through the office windows, they could see the club filling up, the usual crowd of wealthy regulars mixed with tourists and music enthusiasts. None of them knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. Nicole appeared at the door again, this time with news. Calvin Thompson just arrived with his quartet. They're setting up now. She smiled at Marcus. Your father hasn't lost his style, still wearing those sharp suits. Walsh stood abruptly. I should go check on things. Sit down, Richard, Harold said firmly. We're not finished here. Marcus opened the manila envelope and withdrew several documents. Actually, Mr. Walsh, we need to discuss your position here at the club. The house band was wrapping up their set. the last notes of a ballad floating through the walls. Soon Calvin Thompson would take the stage, returning to the venue that had turned him away nearly 5 decades ago. But first, there was business to attend to. Nicole closed the door quietly behind her, but not before they heard the growing buzz from the main room. Word was spreading about tonight's surprise performer. The Sterling Lounge was about to experience a seismic shift in its long history. Marcus laid out the documents one by one: employment records, incident reports, customer complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, text messages from Walsh to the security team with specific screening instructions. Each paper was another nail in the coffin of Walsh's career. "Would you like to explain these?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd earned through years of business success. "Or should we move straight to discussing your severance package?" Outside, the crowd's chatter grew louder as Calvin Thompson stepped onto the stage for his sound check. The first few notes of his piano floated into the office, rich, complex, defiant. The sound of barriers breaking, of history being rewritten. Walsh stared at the documents spread across Harold's desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for one particularly damning text message thread. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of systematic discrimination captured in his own words, his own instructions, his own careful manipulations of the club's policies. "These are private communications," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing is private when it involves discriminating against paying customers, Richard," Marcus replied evenly, "especially not when those communications were conducted on company devices." Through the windows, they could see Calvin Thompson arranging his sheet music on the piano. His quartet, saxophone, bass, and drums, was settling in, running through quick sound checks. The regular crowd was watching with mixed expressions of surprise and curiosity. Several older patrons had already recognized him, whispering excitedly to their companions. "You can't just come in here and—" Walsh began, but Harold cut him off. "He can and he will," Harold said. "The Sterling Lounge was never meant to be what you turned it into, Richard. When my father opened this club in 1960, he wanted it to be about the music, just the music." He gestured to the walls of photos. "Every artist up there earned their place through talent, not the color of their skin. At least, that was true until 1975. The significance of the date hung heavy in the air. Walsh's eyes darted to the photo of young Calvin Thompson, understanding finally dawning on his face. "That night," Harold continued, his voice thick with old regret, "my father was in the hospital. I was young, naive, and I let the manager at the time convince me that turning Calvin away was best for business. It was the biggest mistake of my life, one that you've been systematically repeating." A knock at the door interrupted them. James Marshall entered, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Thompson's ready to start. The word's got out. We've got a line around the block. People are calling about Calvin's return." Marcus checked his watch. "Give us 10 more minutes, James. Then we'll make the announcements." As James left, Walsh seemed to deflate in his chair. "What do you want from me?" "Initially," Marcus leaned forward, "I wanted to fire you on the spot, but I've built my businesses on second chances and transformations. So, I'm offering you a choice." He pulled another document from his briefcase, one that hadn't been on the desk before. "This is a new contract, different position, different responsibilities, significantly different approach to customer relations. You'll work under our new general manager, Nicole Chen." Walsh's head snapped up at that revelation. Nicole, the bartender he'd repeatedly passed over for promotion despite her 15 years of exemplary service. "The contract comes with conditions," Marcus continued. "Anti-discrimination training, community outreach, direct involvement in our new inclusion initiatives. You'll need to earn back trust from the staff, from the community, from yourself." Outside, the anticipation in the crowd was building. Calvin Thompson's quartet had drawn more musicians. Members of the house band were returning to the stage, eager to join in this historic moment. "Or," Marcus said, placing a second document on the desk, "here's your severance package, generous enough to keep this matter private, but firm enough to ensure you understand the seriousness of your actions." The first notes of Calvin's piano drifted into the office, a complex emotional improvisation that made everyone in the room fall silent. It was the same song he'd been planning to play that night in 1975. "One more thing," Marcus added, his voice quiet but firm. Before you make your decision, I want you to sit in the main room and watch my father's entire first set. Watch how music transforms people. Watch how it breaks down barriers. Watch what you've been trying to keep out of this club all these years." Harold stood, straightening his jacket. "I'll make the ownership announcement after the first set. Richard, you have until then to decide." They could hear the murmurs of appreciation from the crowd as Calvin's quartet built upon his introduction. The saxophone joined in, soulful and searching, followed by the steady rhythm of bass and drums. The sound was transformative, filling every corner of the Sterling Lounge with something that had been missing for far too long. Marcus remained seated as Harold led a shell-shocked Walsh to the main room. Through the office windows, he watched his father commanding the stage, decades of pain and perseverance pouring through his fingers into the keys. The audience was transfixed, the room swaying to the rhythm of change. But the night's revelations weren't over yet. As Marcus gathered the documents from Harold's desk, his phone buzzed with messages from other club owners in the area. Word was spreading fast about what was happening at the Sterling Lounge, and not everyone was happy about the changes coming to this exclusive corner of Memphis nightlife. Marcus stepped into the main room just as his father's quartet launched into a blistering rendition of "Round Midnight." The transformation in the club's atmosphere was palpable. Gone was the usual reserved politeness of the Sterling's typical evening crowd, replaced by an electric energy that seemed to pulse through the Art Deco fixtures themselves. His phone buzzed again. Jonathan Pierce, owner of the rival Blue Room across town, was calling for the third time. Marcus silenced it, knowing the local nightlife power brokers would have to wait. Tonight was about something bigger than their comfortable status quo. He spotted Walsh sitting alone at a corner table, untouched scotch before him, watching Calvin Thompson work his magic on the piano. The manager's face was a study in conflicting emotions. Awe at the musicianship, warring with the crumbling of everything he'd believed about maintaining standards. Nicole moved through the crowd with practiced ease, having traded her bartender's apron for a sleek blazer that reflected her new position. She was already embodying her role as general manager, quietly directing staff, ensuring the growing crowd was accommodated. Several longtime servers were watching her with newfound respect, while others, those who'd benefited from Walsh's previous system, wore carefully neutral expressions. The saxophone player launched into a solo that drew appreciative gasps from the audience. Marcus recognized him as Marcus Wilson, a rising star in the Memphis jazz scene who'd been repeatedly denied a chance to play at the Sterling despite his growing reputation. Now, here he was, trading riffs with Calvin Thompson himself, breaking down decades of barriers one note at a time. Harold Sterling appeared at Marcus's elbow, his face glowing with something between pride and relief. "Your father hasn't lost a step," he said softly. "Listen to how he's weaving Dixie into the chord progressions, but deconstructing it, transforming it. Brilliant commentary without saying a word." Indeed, Calvin's musical quotation was subtle but unmistakable to educated ears. The controversial Southern anthem fragmented and reformed into something that spoke of both pain and transcendence. The mostly white audience might not have caught the significance, but the black servers and musicians exchanged knowing looks. James Marshall was by the entrance, dealing with an increasingly complex situation. Word had spread through Memphis's jazz community, and several prominent musicians had arrived, hoping to sit in. More significantly, local media had gotten wind of the story. A reporter from the Memphis Commercial Appeal was trying to talk her way in, while a local TV news crew set up across the street. Marcus's phone buzzed yet again. This time, it was a text from William Hayes, the elderly owner of the prestigious Cotton Club 2 blocks away. "We need to talk. You're disrupting a delicate balance. There will be consequences." A ripple of movement caught Marcus's attention. Walsh had risen from his table, the untouched scotch abandoned as he made his way toward the office. His decision time was approaching, but something in his walk suggested he hadn't yet fully committed to either option. At the bar, a group of regular patrons, the kind who'd kept reserved tables for years, were huddled in intense discussion. One of them, George Whitman, a banking executive who'd been coming to the Sterling for 2 decades, kept glancing between Calvin's performance and Walsh's retreating back. Marcus had seen that look before in corporate takeovers. Old money deciding whether to adapt or withdraw. The song was building to its climax, Calvin's fingers dancing across the keys with decades of stored emotion. The bassist and drummer laid down a groove so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floor, up through the soles of everyone's expensive shoes, forcing even the most resistant bodies to move. Nicole appeared at Marcus's side, with a tablet showing the night's numbers. The bar sales were already breaking records, and they'd had to stop taking dinner reservations due to capacity crowds. But more importantly, she'd noted something remarkable. The usual invisible line dividing white and black patrons in the room had begun to blur. People were mixing, drawn together by the undeniable power of the music. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the entrance. Through the glass doors, Marcus could see Jonathan Pierce himself, along with 3 other prominent club owners demanding entry. James Marshall was holding firm, but the situation was escalating. Calvin, ever the consummate performer, sensed the tension and smoothly transitioned into a complex arrangement of "A Change Is Gonna Come." The Sam Cooke classic floated through the club like a prophecy, making several older patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus felt the weight of his father's gold cufflinks against his wrists, a gift bought with the proceeds from Calvin's first major recording contract, years after that fateful night in 1975. He knew the next few moments would determine not just the Sterling's future, but potentially the future of Memphis nightlife itself. Behind him, Walsh had reappeared, holding what appeared to be one of the 2 contracts. The choice he'd made would set off its own chain of reactions through the club's staff and regular clientele. But before he could approach, another figure pushed through the crowd. A face Marcus recognized from old photographs, someone whose appearance would add yet another layer to the evening's unfolding drama. The man pushing through the crowd was Eugene Walsh, Richard's father and the former manager who'd turned Calvin Thompson away in 1975. At 82, he still carried himself with the same rigid authority that had defined his 20-year tenure at the Sterling Lounge. His appearance sent a visible shock through the older staff members who remembered his reign. Richard Walsh's face drained of color at the sight of his father. The contract in his hand trembled slightly as Eugene approached, his expression unreadable. The older Walsh had been a legendary figure in Memphis nightlife, the man who'd established the Sterling's exclusive reputation, a code word whose meaning had shaped the club's culture for decades. Calvin Thompson's fingers never faltered on the keys, but Marcus saw his father's shoulders tense slightly. The last time these 2 men had been in the same room, words had been exchanged that had echoed through decades of Memphis's cultural history. "What's the meaning of this circus?" Eugene demanded, his voice carrying over the music to where Richard stood. "I get a call saying you're letting the whole place go to hell, and I find this?" He gestured dismissively toward the stage. The quartet was just finishing "A Change Is Gonna Come," the last notes hanging in the air like a challenge. Calvin smoothly transitioned into a complex bebop number, one he'd composed himself years ago. Its title, though unspoken tonight, was "The Doorman's Blues," a cutting musical commentary on his experience at the Sterling. Outside, the situation with the rival club owners was escalating. Jonathan Pierce could be heard arguing with James Marshall. "You can't just change the rules overnight. There are expectations, traditions." Nicole stepped forward, her new authority evident in her stance. "Mr. Walsh, the elder Mr. Walsh, this is a private establishment, and you're not on tonight's guest list." The steel in her voice caught Eugene off guard. He remembered her as a junior bartender who'd known her place. "Do you know who I am, girl?" he bristled. "A former employee," Nicole replied coolly. "Nothing more." Marcus watched Richard Walsh's expression shift as he witnessed this exchange. Something seemed to crystallize in his face as he looked down at the contract in his hand, then back at his father. The music had shifted again, Calvin leading his quartet through an intricate arrangement that wove together themes from civil rights era, protest songs with traditional jazz standards. The message was subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew their history. Through the windows, camera flashes were becoming more frequent. The story was growing beyond the Sterling's walls. Marcus's phone had dozens of missed calls now, including several from national jazz publications. George Whitman rose from his table, straightening his expensive suit. The banking executive cleared his throat. "Eugene, times change. Maybe they should have changed sooner." Several other longtime patrons nodded in agreement, though some remained stubbornly silent. Eugene Walsh turned to his son. Richard, are you going to let them destroy everything we built, everything I taught you? Richard Walsh looked at the contract in his hand, then at Nicole's composed face, at the diverse crowd swaying to Calvin's music, at Marcus standing calm and confident, and finally at his father, seeing him perhaps for the first time not as an authority figure, but as a man trapped in outdated prejudices. "You taught me to survive, Dad," Richard said quietly. "But maybe it's time to learn how to live instead." He turned to Marcus and held up the contract. "I'd like to accept the new position, if Ms. Chen is willing to have me on her team." Eugene's face darkened. "You'll regret this. All of you will. I still have friends in this town. Influence—" "Dad," Richard interrupted, his voice stronger now. "It's over. That world is over." The quartet hit a crescendo, and spontaneous applause broke out across the club. Calvin ended his solo with a flourish that somehow managed to sound both triumphant and healing. As the applause died down, he spoke into the microphone for the first time that night. "Next song goes out to a door that closed in 1975, his rich voice filled the room, "and to all the doors opening tonight." Outside, more cars were pulling up. Word had spread beyond Memphis's usual jazz crowd. Civil rights leaders, music industry veterans, and even a state senator had arrived. The story was growing, transforming from a personal triumph to something that could reshape the city's cultural landscape. Jonathan Pierce and his fellow club owners had retreated to the shadows across the street, huddled in intense discussion. Their world was changing before their eyes, and they knew it. Marcus felt his phone buzz again. This time, it was a text from an unexpected source, Harold Sterling's daughter, Sarah, who'd left the family business years ago after arguments with her father about the club's direction. "Dad just called. I'm on my way. Maybe it's time to come home." The night was far from over. As Calvin launched into another song, Marcus could see the threads of change weaving through the Sterling lounge, binding past to present, hurt to healing, resistance to acceptance. But beneath it all, there was still that current of tension, the knowledge that not everyone would accept this transformation quietly. Sarah Sterling's black Tesla pulled up just as Calvin's quartet finished another powerful number. At 35, she looked every bit the successful Los Angeles entertainment lawyer she'd become, sharp, confident, and completely at home in the chaos unfolding outside her family's club. The news crews turned their cameras toward her, recognizing the prodigal daughter's return. Inside, Eugene Walsh hadn't moved from his spot, watching his son Richard being introduced to his new role by Nicole. The elderly man's face was a mask of barely contained fury as Nicole explained how Richard would help implement their new community outreach programs. "Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave, Harold," Eugene spat as Sarah entered the club. "Both of you betraying everything the Sterling stands for." "No, Eugene," Harold replied calmly. "We're finally living up to what the Sterling was meant to be, what my father wanted before people like you twisted it." Sarah's arrival caused another ripple through the crowd. Many remembered the fierce arguments she'd had with Harold 5 years ago, challenging the club's unwritten policies. She'd left Memphis shortly after, but not before submitting a detailed report to the city council about discriminatory practices in local entertainment venues. The report had been quietly buried, but its contents had never been forgotten. Calvin Thompson segued into, "What a wonderful world," but his arrangement was complex, layered with minor chords that suggested both hope and struggle. On stage, more musicians had joined in. The house band was back, along with several prominent players from other clubs. The music was becoming something bigger than any one performer. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his secretary. CNN wanted a comment about the integration of Memphis's last segregated jazz club. The story was going national. Similar messages followed from the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and NPR. Jonathan Pierce had retreated to the Blue Room, but his influence was being felt. Several regular Sterling patrons were receiving texts, reminding them of their membership status at other exclusive clubs in the city. A few got up to leave, though most stayed, drawn by the historic nature of the evening and the undeniable power of the music. "Mr. Thompson," a voice called out. It was George Whitman, the banking executive. "A word." He gestured toward a quiet corner. Marcus followed, noting how Richard Walsh watched the interaction carefully. The younger Walsh seemed to be studying everything with new eyes, as if seeing the complex social dynamics of the club clearly for the first time. "They're organizing against you," Whitman said quietly. "Pierce, Randolph over at the Medallion, Carter from Le Jazz, they're calling in favors, threatening to pull strings with suppliers, musicians, liquor licenses." "And where do you stand, George?" Whitman glanced at the stage, where Calvin's quartet was demonstrating exactly why he'd been considered one of the city's finest pianists before being shut out. "I've been banking in this town for 30 years. Never lost money betting on progress." He pulled out his phone. "Want me to make some calls? Remind certain people which way the wind is blowing?" Sarah Sterling had reached her father's side, their reunion a quiet moment in the midst of the chaos. 5 years of distance seemed to dissolve as they watched Calvin play. She'd learned to play piano from him as a child, before learning about what had happened in 1975. Eugene Walsh was making his way toward the exit, but his path took him past the stage. Calvin Thompson looked down at the man who'd barred his entry 49 years ago. Their eyes met, decades of history passing between them. Calvin never missed a note, but he did something subtle with the harmony, transformed the melody of "What a Wonderful World" into something that spoke of both forgiveness and accountability. The door opened again, admitting a group of younger people, music students from the local university, drawn by social media buzz about what was happening. They represented a new Memphis, one that saw the city's musical heritage as something to celebrate rather than segregate. Nicole appeared at Marcus's side with more updates. The kitchen was staying open late to handle the crowd. The bar had already beaten its monthly revenue record. Staff who'd been off tonight were calling in, asking to come help. Something fundamental had shifted in the Sterling's DNA. Marcus's phone buzzed again, a message from one of his investors. "Pierce is calling an emergency meeting of the Downtown Entertainment Association tomorrow morning. Claims you're destabilizing the market. Want me to gather the troops?" Richard Walsh had found a quiet spot to read through his new contract more carefully. His father's dramatic exit seemed to have lifted a weight from his shoulders. He was making notes, not about restrictions or exclusions, but about ideas for the future. The music swelled, Calvin Thompson's quartet, joined by what had become an impromptu all-star ensemble of Memphis's finest musicians. Black and white, young and old, they created something that transcended the club's troubled history. But even as the music soared, Marcus could feel the pressure building outside the Sterling's walls. The old guard wouldn't surrender their influence without a fight. The mounting opposition from Memphis's old guard deserved attention, but Marcus knew the real story was unfolding inside the Sterling's walls. As midnight approached, Calvin Thompson's impromptu supergroup had transformed the club into something magical, a glimpse of what Memphis nightlife could become. Jonathan Pierce's emergency meeting could wait. William Hayes's threats about supplier boycotts would be handled. Right now, Marcus watched as Richard Walsh did something unprecedented. He walked up to the stage during a brief break between songs. The room hushed. Even the reporters outside pressed against the windows, sensing another historic moment. Walsh took the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice carrying through the now silent club. 49 years ago, a man standing in my position made a terrible decision. The shame of that decision has lived in this building's walls, in its music, in its very foundation." He paused, gathering himself. "I've spent 12 years continuing that legacy of exclusion, convinced I was protecting something valuable. Tonight, I finally understand what we were really keeping out." Calvin Thompson's face remained impassive, his hands resting lightly on the piano keys. Sarah Sterling had moved closer to the stage, recording everything on her phone. This would be evidence of a different sort, proof that change was possible. "I can't undo what my father did," Richard continued. "I can't erase my own actions. But starting tonight, working under Ms. Chen's leadership, I commit myself to making the Sterling what it always should have been. A home for the music, all the music, and everyone who loves it." He turned to face the crowd, including the longtime patrons who'd benefited from his previous policies. "Some of you will leave, some of you will fight this change. But look around, listen. This is Memphis's soul, finally being allowed to sing fully, freely, together." The moment hung in the air, fragile as a sustained note. Then Calvin Thompson played a soft chord, a subtle invitation. Richard Walsh turned back to him, understanding passing between them. "Welcome home," Richard said simply, and stepped off the stage. The music that followed was unlike anything the Sterling had ever hosted, Joy and pain, triumph and healing, all woven together by musicians who'd been kept apart for too long. The crowd moved as one, social barriers crumbling under the sheer force of artistry unleashed. Marcus felt his phone buzz one last time that night. It was a message from the president of the National Jazz Foundation. What's happening at the Sterling tonight is going to be remembered. How can we help make sure it's just the beginning? He looked around the club, at Nicole confidently directing her staff, at Sarah and Harold Sterling embracing their new path forward, at Richard Walsh finally standing on the right side of history, and at his father, Calvin Thompson, playing the music he had been denied nearly 5 decades ago. The Sterling Lounge had been built on exclusion, but it would be rebuilt on inclusion. The old guard of Memphis nightlife would resist, but they were fighting against a tide that had been held back too long. Every note played tonight was a declaration, not just of change, but of restoration, of making things right. As Calvin Thompson's quartet eased into their final song of the night, a soul-stirring rendition of At Last, Marcus understood that they weren't just creating music. They were creating precedent. Every black musician turned away from a club, every patron made to feel unwelcome, every tradition used to justify discrimination, all of it was being answered by this moment. The song ended, and Calvin Thompson finally spoke to the crowd. Some doors take a lifetime to open, but once they do, no one can close them again. He looked at his son with pride. The Sterling Lounge is under new management. The applause that followed wasn't just for the music, it was for every barrier broken, every wrong acknowledged, every step toward a better future. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to hint at the horizon. The night of change was ending, but its effects would ripple through Memphis for years to come. Marcus knew tomorrow would bring challenges. Angry calls from other club owners, pressure from old money patrons, attempts to maintain the status quo. But tonight had proven that the most powerful agent of change was simply letting the music play as it was always meant to, free, authentic, and open to all. The Sterling Lounge would never be the same, and that was exactly the point.